Let's move on to another category now, because this 94 is kind of a peak for certainly the initial wave of trip hop music. Partly the reason it's a peak is because Portishead's Dummy came out this year, which I guess along with Massive Attack's Blue Lines is kind of the year zero for, or at least the archetypal textbook trip hop record. Now I know, for example, that Jeff Barrow from Portishead would hate that the album would be even considered as a trip hop record. But Jeff, I'm sorry, this is kind of like it's almost the defining record for trip hop. It's that idea of taking elements of lo-fi, plunderphonics, and sampling stuff from old Spy records, and that kind of cold, almost kind of distant femme fatale female voice over the top, and those old John Barry, Ennio Morricone guitar lines. To me, that's kind of what I think of as the quintessential trip-hop sound. And this is the quintessential trip-hop record. And actually, it's probably my least favourite Portishead record. I think it's the one that's dated the most, partly because it's the one that's been the most imitated. I love their third record. I think the third record is amazing, but they were reaching for something else there. This record has been endlessly imitated, to the point, actually, when I went back to listen to it for the purposes of talking about it here, it didn't quite have the impact that I remember it having on me at the time, which was massive. I'm going to cue it up, Tim. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, it's dark, cinematic, dramatic, and it was something that I think we were both immediately drawn to. It was a fresh sound, plus it had enough of things that we already liked. As Stephen alluded to, there was quite a lot of a John Barry influence, and I think they even sampled Barry in a couple of the pieces. I mean, I would argue that these ideas had been out there for a few years. Even some early No Man tracks like Colours or Days in the Trees were operating in a relatively similar territory with relatively similar influences, but they pulled it together, and they pulled it together brilliantly. And we heard this probably a few months before it was released, because our A&R man at the publishing company at the time was trying to sign them for the publishing company, and he was from Bristol, as Portishead were from Bristol.
Well, but I mean, Massive Attack had released Blue Lines in what, 89, 90, wasn't it? So
no, 91, I think.
Oh, okay, so trip hop had been around for a while already, hadn't it? And I think even if you go back and listen to things like 3 Feet High and Rising from 89, De La Soul,
there were elements of that. Yeah.
There's a lot of elements of that kind of idea of the plunderphonics, sampling from different records, lo-fi, vinyl crackle, all of that stuff. But it was almost the kind of fusing that with the soundtrack aesthetic, John Barry, Ennio Morricone.
And also, it was I think the point is as well, I think that if the seeds of this existed over the previous 6 years, nobody had pulled together an album that was coherently this until Dummy. I think Dummy was this wonderful shock of sound. And I thought, that whole Bristol scene of Tricky, Massive Attack, Portishead, it was compelling, it was inventive, and I still draw quite a lot from it today.
So let's talk about the other big trip hop album from this year, which is the second Massive Attack album. So Massive Attack had kind of laid down the blueprint in a way for what we call trip hop 3 years earlier with Blue Lines. It came out with the second album, Protection. Now I'm a big fan of the first album, and I'm a big fan of Mezzanine. To me, that's their masterpiece, which came out a couple of years after this record. So this is what I would think of as a transitional record for them. It's a record I probably spent less time with than Blue Lines and Mezzanine, but it's still got some phenomenal tracks on it. I think what was interesting about Massive Attack is their taste in singers. They always chose brilliant singers. So on this record, on the first record, they're working obviously with Shara Nelson. On Mezzanine, they had Liz Fraser, which is just a stroke of genius to me to bring Liz Fraser in. On this record, it's Tracy Thorn, another amazing female voice that you wouldn't associate with club culture.
And it reinvented Everything But the Girl in its wake, really, because Everything But the Girl have a really lovely album out in '94 called Amplified Heart, but this is their tribute to Witch Season and the acoustic singer-songwriter albums of the early 70s. And after her dalliance with Massive Attack, you get Walking Wounded in '96, I think, which is one of my favourite Everything But the Girl albums, glorious album. She has a marvellous voice. I mean, like you, I kind of, with Massive Attack, my favourite actually, it's Mezzanine, and I think Thousandth Window.
Thousandth Window is brilliant too,
which I think is a stunning
with Sinead
record.
O'Connor singing on that one, yeah. So they kind of had this, they almost had this pattern of every album choosing to work with a British female singer, or Irish in the case of Sinead, that you wouldn't necessarily associate with being someone that would
So
sing.
they had Horace Andy from the reggae background, also Terry Callier sang with them.
They did, yeah, they had other people too, yeah. But on this record, Tracy Thorn, and we'll just listen to a little bit of... whenever I hear this song, I always think of the video, the Protection video. I'm sure people must have seen it. I forget the name of the director now, very famous film director, wasn't it, that directed it?
Alfred Hitchcock.
Not Alfred Hitchcock, no. I've forgotten his name now, but a brilliant, one of the best videos ever made for me. But I think Massive Attack, certainly compared to Portishead, they have much less of that kind of lo-fi aesthetic. It's quite produced, isn't it? This song, and also it's true of Teardrop from the next album, which is one of my favourite pieces of music ever, period, is that use of the repeating piano ostinato.
Sure.
And again, this relates back to something you're saying, the influence in a way that's coming from classical minimalist music around this time, and a lot of electronic music, in trip-hop music, this idea of these repeating lines building and chordal shifts within that, and you hear it very clearly.
I think also I like the Spartan production. Again, listening to that, there's not very much in it, so when a new sound comes in, like when the synth pulse came in, it really gripped you. Although I kind of like, one of the reasons I like Mezzanine and A Thousand Windows more is that every sound is immaculate. So even the bass drum sound is almost unique to them. It's like they've spent 10,000 hours honing this unique sound.
Did.
Yeah, they probably did. Yeah.
I think notoriously Massive Attack are taken increasingly long to make each record.
So that sounds great, but I think by the next album, every sonic element is quite unique to them.
I love Mezzanine.
Yeah.
Wow, what a great album that is. This is a great album too. They just have such a great, again, I think like the Trent Reznor Nine Inch Nails, they have this great kind of producer sensibility. Like you say, everything is exquisite. It's not about the cult of personality. In fact, quite often they're almost quite happy to retreat into the background. Sure. To the point that when you see the band on stage, you do, well, who's actually in Massive Attack? I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's about the music.
They probably could and do walk around Bristol unnoticed.
They probably do. They probably do. It's just about making these exquisite records and the curiosity that seems to be going on all the time in the music. What's possible with the technology, and also the fact they come from hip hop culture. They were all hanging out with Banksy, graffiti artists.
What was interesting, if you look at Massive Attack, and I think this is true of Tricky, maybe it's true of Portishead, is that it was colliding because Bristol and Bath were quite well known for experimental post-punk and dub, and so you had all of these influences from dub, reggae culture, the post-punk bands, and then the dance hip-hop culture.
It's very British, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a very British sound. Now you're talking about it. It's something about trip-hop that seems very British. The closest comparisons I can think of in America would be things like the DJ Shadow Introducing album. Again, that kind of crate-digging mentality. But there's something very British about the sound of Portishead, Massive Attack, and all of the imitators that came out. Let's move on to another category. We're getting through these. It's good. Believe me, sometimes we've been known to talk for 5 or 6 hours about a particular year. That's not going to happen today, don't worry.
About a bass drum.
Yeah. There's another form of music that seemed to be in the ascendancy in 1994 that has continued to ascend into mainstream popular culture. And I think there's a very strong reason for that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm talking about the neoclassical genre. Now, neoclassical music had been around for a few years before this. I remember discovering things like Arvo Pärd's Tabula Rasa, Goretzky's Symphony No. 3, a few years before this, and they were kind of big records. But in 1994, a couple of records crossed over from that kind of classical world into the mainstream and sold, I believe, literally millions of copies. One of them is Jan Garbarek and Hilliard Ensemble's Officium record. And the other one, which if you don't know, is kind of a mixture of traditional Gregorian chant, but with Jan Garbarek, the Norwegian saxophone player, basically improvising over the top. Incredibly beautiful. We can play a little bit off my phone, high tech, in a minute. But the other one was the Carl Jenkins album, Adi Amos. And these records kind of crossed over from classic FM, classical radio stations, to a massive, massive audience. Now, it's interesting because nowadays we have a lot more of that going on. Artists like Max Richter now rack up millions and millions and millions of plays on Spotify and streaming platforms. I believe Sleep is now the most streamed piece of classical music ever made. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that people listen to it while they're asleep. If you don't know, Max Richter's Sleep is an 8-hour piece of music designed to be listened to.
I mean, it's very beautiful.
It's beautiful, but it's designed to be listened to while people are basically sleeping or trying to get to sleep. Even my kids listen to it. They're 13 and 11. They put on Max Richter's Sleep when they're trying to go to sleep. So it's become a massive, millions and millions and millions and millions of streams on Spotify now. And I think there's something about neoclassical music that fits lifestyle in 2024, whether it's a playlist for music for yoga, music for coffee time, music for relaxation. A lot of this music is being listened to without being listened to. But I think there's something, even in 1994, there's an appetite for music which returns to something more organic, something people can relate to more to traditional classical music, but also simpler, about melody. And I think that, again, you mentioned this influence of minimalism music. Again, it's reducing classical music to something more minimal, more about melodies and repetition.
And more user-friendly.
And more user-friendly.
I mean, it's funny because I mean, like you, I loved Arvo Pärt, I loved Goretzky. Obviously, I was a huge fan of the American minimalists as well. But this music sort of passed me by. I bought the Jan Garbarek. My dad bought the Carl Jenkins.
Exactly. Your dad bought the Carl Jenkins.
Yes. Yeah. He was in Soft Machine as well, which is an interesting fact.
This is the Hilliard Ensemble in Jan Garbarek record. It's incredibly beautiful. But it's also something you can put on in the dinner party and kind of ignore it as well.
Yeah, and it's a unique combination in a way of this jazz player who started off being quite aggressive and free jazz, some of his very early albums, with, as you say, almost a Gregorian style choir.
It's that fusion of the old and the new.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you listen to that now and you think, well, why didn't somebody do this before?
Exactly.
It's a jazz improviser, a jazz saxophonist,
and people
improvising over essentially what is ancient, old-fashioned Gregorian chant music, and it just works. It just works effortlessly. And of course, again, like the trip we talked about, the trip hop, giving rise to so many imitators, it kind of became a trope in itself to do something like this.
I was about to say that, in English cathedrals, directly after this, you got some cellist who'd be improvising over an orchestra or a choir or a trumpet player doing the same thing. There are even homegrown versions of this in local...
It's almost impossible to go wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, it works. It's a lovely experience.
Just the acoustics of a cathedral. I mean, anything sounds good in the acoustics of a cathedral.
But then you walk out of the cathedral and you've forgotten it.
But that's interesting, isn't it? That this is kind of the beginning of what we think of now as neoclassical music. And there are some very successful neoclassical composers now. Max Richter, Johan Johansson, Niels Vrooom in a way also would kind of tap in to that, making this, I guess, a kind of very modern equivalent to classical music, but they're composers that have grown up also listening to Aphex Twin and Radiohead. And that's also channeled, and Pink Floyd, and that's also channeled into what they do. And I love it, but I think a lot of people listen to it without listening to it. It's become the new kind of background music in a way, the new ambient music in a way. I read as a sort of sidebar to this. I read a brilliant book by Michel Faber, the guy who wrote Under the Skin, and he wrote this book called Listen. I think it's called Listen, and there are some statistics in that book that blew my mind. He's writing about the whole culture of listening. How do we engage with music? How do we listen to music in the 21st century? And he said, one of the statistics he writes in the book is only 2% of music is actually listened to. So that means the other 98% of the music going on in the world is kind of happening somewhere in the background. It might be it might be the soundtrack of the TV show you're watching.
Yeah.
It might be the music in the clothes shop while you're shopping, or the supermarket. It might be in the playlist you've put on while you're doing your yoga or you're having your coffee. 98% of music is kind of engaged with in a very passive. People are not listening to it, essentially. It's just on the background. To me, that tells me a lot about the state of music in 2024, you know. So it's sad, but it makes perfect sense to me that would be, that seems to reflect my experience also. And I make records, we both make records that are kind of, we're expecting people to engage with them, to listen to them, to go on a journey, to allow us to take them on a journey for 45 minutes or whatever, without them checking their email, without them making themselves a coffee or a sandwich. And that's a very unfashionable approach to making music in 2024.
But the more unfashionable it is, the more I want to do it.
The more I want to do it, yes. But
Yeah.
that's interesting, isn't it? Because in a way, that's become the true alternative music.
Yeah.
People used to talk about alternative. Nirvana is alternative. No, it's not. It's the most mainstream thing you can possibly think of. What's alternative is to make albums now that are supposed to be listened to from beginning to end.
Well, yeah,
That's alternative music.
You know, for me, when I'm making albums, seriously, I can take up to 30 attempts to get the sequencing right, dropping pieces and so on, because the album experience, the artwork, regardless of whether it's going to be loved, it's important to me that the details, the quality,
But that's because we grew up with Pink Floyd records, and we grew up with records where it really felt like every tiny detail.
But even here, as we're saying, you know,
Yeah.
something like Nine Inch Nails works because it's not just the music; it's the enigmatic properties
It's
of
the
the
whole
sleeve
visual aesthetic,
artwork.
yeah.
It's also his quite pared down poetry. There are so many aspects to that album that I love.
Let's talk about another big thing that was happening, at least in Britain, was Britpop. Did Britpop mean anything? I don't know, did it? Some of these bands, right? Oasis, I'm guessing probably yes, were pretty big. Blur, were they? Blur were. Who was? Suede, did they do anything?
Supergrass, yeah.
Pulp, yeah.
Menswear. No, man.
Manic Street Preachers. So
Funny you mentioned that band.
this year is kind of a high point for Britpop, and this record, as you can see here now, obviously very topical right now because Oasis have come back. And I think it's fair to say that
Only £700 a ticket.
Only £700 a ticket, dynamic price. I think it's fair to say that Oasis' entire reputation pretty much rests on this album and its follow-up. So this album, and it is a great debut record. I'm going to guess it's not really your kind of thing, Tim. It's not really mine either. You know, it's one of those points in time where a new band come along and their sound seems somehow instantly familiar and likable, and it has a personality and a refreshing attitude to it without really confronting anything about your ideas about what music is. I think that's it. Oasis sounded safe, familiar, but there was enough personality and swagger about the way they did it that made it seem a cut above everything else.
You know, they had a charisma, they did write very catchy songs, and I think that their humour in interviews came across well. So they loved the Beatles, I think we know this, but they also managed to mimic the Beatles' ability. If you ever watch those early Beatles interviews, they're incredibly witty, incredibly spontaneous, and that was as much a part of their appeal as their brilliant music. And I think with Oasis, certainly with the British press, they were quite quick-witted, they were quite eccentric, and that was also a part of their appeal. And I remember, because I came from near Manchester, I was sort of born and brought up between Liverpool and Manchester, and there used to be a cafe called the Oasis Cafe as soon as they become famous. And of course, they would have soup in which they would proudly proclaim, "You get a roll with it." So, if you know, it's a roll, a bread roll with it. So, yeah, Roll With It was a big Oasis single, if you don't know.
But there's very good, Tim. Very good. That was a joke, by the way.
It was true. It was not a joke. It actually did
yeah.
happen. There was the Oasis Cafe with the logo outside of Affleck's Palace.
But there's a couple of songs in this record that I would, you know, on any basis, I would say they are brilliant songs. And they have it on this record. They have that mixture of great songs, swagger, arrogance, personality, and something that is instantly familiar to you.
There's a kind of classic rock familiarity, but also I think, as you're talking about the swagger, I think that with Liam Gallagher's voice, he's almost got that kind of Johnny Rotten casual quality in there as well. That there's a sort of
he's got that Mancunian,
a not give a shitness about it, which they pull off.
He's a great frontman. He's a great singer, you know, and I think together with Noel's plundering of 20, bless him, you know, in the best possible sense of the word, plundering 20, 30 years of pop music and the Beatles catalogue particularly, and just putting enough of a twist on it, but it's instantly familiar. There's nothing about that that's going to confront your idea
but it
about
works
what music
because
can be.
There's a conviction in the performance, and Noel Gallagher genuinely loves what he's doing. I think
and he writes great songs.
Also comes through.
Now, their big competitors during this time were Blur. And this album, Parklife, came out this year. I'm not so familiar with Blur. I have to say, I've never listened to this record. I never was particularly interested in Blur. You're the Blur expert, Tim. Tell us about Blur, Parklife. Tell us about this album.
Well, I think one of the reasons why, you know, in the Blur versus Oasis wars, which were incredibly childish, I'd have probably sided with Blur, partly because I think Damon Albarn was always a canny songwriter and tunesmith, but I think that he had incredibly eclectic tastes. And you can hear this even in Parklife, where they will go from something that's Bowie and Fripp inspired to something that's quite Scott Walker inspired to the Cockney claptrap of Parklife itself, and they pulled it all off. So there was an eclecticism that you can then hear later when he's doing Gorillaz. You can hear it in his solo work. That to me, it was never a surprise that they were, let's say, experimenting with Moroccan rhythms or soundtrack elements.
It's much more playful, isn't it, than a lot of the other Britpop. They don't seem content just to, you know, trot out some old Kinks and Beatles.
Not
licks.
although they've got that in there. I think the point is that
yeah.
he shows he can do what everyone else is doing, but he's doing 6 other things at the same time.
Let's have a quick listen to, I mean, this is the big single off the record, Girls and Boys. I do remember this.
It's like a jungle, so call the police.
So the problem I have with that straight away is I know Damon Albarn comes from a very rich upper-class family, and he's doing the Cockney geezer.
But I think
I'm a Cockney geezer. And strangely, when I hear Liam Gallagher doing the Mancunian accent, I believe that is him. That's him. He's from Manchester. He's a scally. I believe it. I don't believe that bloke. I'm a Cockney geezer. Don't believe it.
You think he's a pearly king, don't you?
I think he's faking it.
But he was clearly a talent. And I think, there might have been an element of doing things to gain attention, but he was clearly intelligent, clearly a talent. And on the album, he doesn't just do that. I think anyone who's heard Parklife knows he's doing quite a number of things. So the seeds of what he becomes are already on that record. And it's an interesting thing, because I think we're going to talk probably about Suede's Dogman Star, because because Brett Anderson did genuinely come from a working class British upbringing. And a bit like David Sylvian, a bit like Brian Ferry, he was one of these people who was quite aspirational. His music was reaching for the stars, where you get people, as you've said, Damon Albarn probably comes from a public school background and is doing the I'm a Cockney geezer.
I'm not the biggest fan, but Bruce Springsteen's got this one-man show he's been doing. And one of the things apparently he says in the show is that he always thought of himself as this incredible fake, because his songs are all supposedly about the American blue-collar workers, and they appeal to that demographic. He said, that was never me. That was never me. You know, he was a successful rock star almost from the beginning of his career. He said, I'm writing songs about things that I've never directly experienced. Is that necessarily something that should stop you?
Not at all.
You know, I've written songs about nuclear war. I've never been in one.
Have you not?
No. So,
I think we had one in Warrington in 1987.
Why should I write a song like Radioactive Talk? I never experienced it. So is there a sense that just because you haven't experienced, just because Damon Albarn isn't a Cockney geezer, should he be excluded from being able to write
Not
from
at
that
all.
perspective?
I mean, I'm all for, Randy Newman,
That's
who's
an
one of
actor,
my
isn't it?
favourites. Randy Newman came from almost Hollywood royalty. I think his uncle was a composer for soundtracks. His father was extraordinarily affluent. And he writes the most beautiful songs of working class America with a sympathetic, literate approach. His are almost like short stories. So, of course, you can do it. And you can do it well, but what I guess he's not doing is putting on a stupid southern Texas accent and almost, in a sense, patronizing the people he's talking about. The same with Bruce Springsteen. Bruce Springsteen is like a great short story writer. And of course, we all see things in our lives that aren't directly our lives. I've written songs about the homeless, which aren't like Phil Collins' Another Day in Paradise.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? When Bono and people like that
Yeah.
write songs about, the poverty in the world, it's terrible, isn't it? And you just don't believe it.
Exactly.
You can't, it's very hard to relate to that sentiment when you know that it's a multi-billionaire rock star singing about it. But then what else are they going to sing about? We need to move on, Tim, because we're running out of time. But Manic Street Preachers, The Holy Bible, James Wawa, Morrissey, Vauxhall and I, Pulp, isn't it? This is a real high watermark for Britpop this year. Auteurs, Now I'm a Cowboy. Let's talk about a couple more. You've kind of mentioned it already, Tim. Suede, Dogman Star. Suede, for me, they were like the Pink Floyd of this scene because they're reaching for the stars. They've got that Bowie thing going on. The albums are much more pretentious, and I mean that in a positive way. They've got more of that tortured artist effect going on, haven't they? And I love it for them. But, Dogman Star, are these guys interested in Bowie? Oh, I wonder. Diamond Dogs plus Man Who Sold the World plus Ziggy Stardust. Oh, we've got Dogman Star. Just take a word from 3 Bowie titles, put them together. And I always saw that as a little bit of a big clue as to where these guys were coming from. And there is a lot of Bowie going on here, but they've got their own sound, haven't they? They've definitely got something distinctive going on, if only in his voice and Bernard Butler's guitar.
The interesting thing about Suede is that they partly ushered in Britpop because they had elements of Bowie meeting elements of Smiths, and their debut album also had some really heartbreaking ballads. That was the
Floyd
aspect.
as well.
Yeah, a lot of Floyd. That was the aspect of the music I like the best. Some of their B-sides, tracks like The Big Time, I think you could see where they were coming from. And on this album, where Britpop has come to the fore, they're a big influence on Britpop. They suddenly do this huge conceptual, bloated work, and I love it for that.
Yeah, it's a great
it's
record.
the opposite of what the other bands are doing. And again, although they would lay good claim to writing, I'm a Cockney geezer, they don't do it.
It's pretentious in the best possible sense of the word, isn't it? And one of the things we say on the podcast quite a lot is there's not enough pretentiousness in contemporary pop music these days, is there?
No.
We like big gestures. We like artists to risk being humiliated and falling flat on their face, but at least they're trying, they're reaching. It's almost like the opposite of the Oasis effect. It's like, no, okay, Oasis is great, fine. We're happy that exists, but we also love bands to be ridiculously pretentious, portentous, reach for the stars, do something that risks being ridiculous.
The thing about Suede is there's a kind of hysterical, emotional quality as well, which I quite like. And I think with their artwork, I said this before, that the Smiths and Marillion, in some ways, were two sides of the same coin, in that they had a kind of a bed-sitter intensity, a particular focus on the artwork. And I kind of find that in Suede as well. And the cover for this album has that
strong identity,
bed-sit intensity. And they had a great visual identity with the logo that was ongoing and the artwork, in addition to the music.
And I believe it. I believe the music.
Yeah.
I mean, Brett Anderson's books, by the way, if you haven't read Brett Anderson's books, they are fantastic. He kind of lived the life. I've always found it a little bit difficult to connect with music that has such a kind of a limited musical vocabulary, musical palette. Okay, so it's not the kind of music I would ever listen to. Now, the exception to that is this record, which I think is fucking masterpiece, Superunknown by Soundgarden. Sorry about that. This is a really great record, and I think one of the reasons I like it is for the same reason we were talking about Chris Cornell in relation to Jeff Buckley earlier. He's got that voice that can soar, and he can make an average song sound thrilling just by virtue of the quality of his voice. And the songwriting is brilliant. I mean, Black Hole Sun, What a great song. And there are unusual chordal shifts.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, this is an exception for me, and I think it's a brilliant album. They're a brilliant band. I think this is the thing, again, that, as with Jeff Buckley, you've got this astonishing vocalist, this astonishing band, and as with the Jeff Buckley band, it's almost like they've reinvented the best of that late 60s, early 70s hard rock scene. So when I was listening to that, what I wasn't hearing is what people said at the time, oh, grunge, it's a combination of punk and heavy metal. What I was hearing was a fresh reinvention of that kind of elastic hard rock that you hear in Free, Bad Company, Led Zeppelin, and they were doing it with amazing power and ability as a band, I thought. And it's very varied as a sonic palette as well.
It is, yeah. There's a lot more of the, as you say, the legacy of heavy rock music going back to the 70s. I hear a lot more of it in it, but it doesn't sound dated.
No,
it doesn't
not at all.
sound dated.
Well, this is what I mean. It's a reinvention. It's a 90s reinvention with all of the production benefits that the 90s could bestow upon an album.
The other thing I really like about this is, and this is something that we talk about with Led Zeppelin as well, is you can hear they understand the funk.
Yeah.
They've got that groove, that, you know, that the whole thing that Bonham was always fundamental to with Zeppelin. They've kind of got that swagger and funky groove going on as well. So it's not, and AC/DC of course always had that too. Just
and there's a kind
grooves.
of R&B soulfulness in his voice as well.
He's a great singer, great vocalist, other records that came out this year in this category, I don't know any of these records. Green Day, Dookie. It's funny because my wife is 15 years younger than me, and all her friends, her generation of friends, Green Day and Guns N' Roses, they all absolutely adore these bands. And I know very little about them. I think it just bypassed me completely in 1994. Green Day, Dookie, Weezer's first album. To me, it sounds quite traditional, this American rock sound. It doesn't appeal to me, but there's some records that were very big this year, so I'm just basically name-checking them. R.E.M. Monster. You're our resident R.E.M.
It's good. Well, I
expert,
like,
Tim.
I like R.E.M. I loved Automatic for the People, and this was nice because a bit like Suede's Dogman Star, it was basically punching the people who'd loved what they'd done previously. It was going off into a new direction, and I really like the fact that at the peak of their fame, with certain albums, New Adventures and Hi-Fi as well, that they didn't do what was expected of them. They could have made Everybody Hurts until they died, and they didn't. And the same with Suede. They could have continued along that Britpop path, but they didn't. And I think that's what we like in music when, an artist like Bowie did this in the 70s constantly. As soon as you had him pegged as something, he was something different.
Right, we've got about 12 minutes to get through about 30 albums, so we're not going to do it. Okay. So let's just quickly move on. So progressive rock, obviously 1994 is not an era you think of necessarily as being a strong year for progressive rock. The best progressive rock album for the year for me is Future Sound of London's Lifeforms. And this is interesting. I'm being slightly facetious here because really this should be in the electronic category. But there's something about Future Sound of London that is completely in the tradition of conceptual rock music, even to the point they signed to Virgin and wanted the old Roger Dean Virgin logo on their records. They are obviously progressive rock fans that have come through techno club culture, but they also love Tangerine Dream, Vangelis. Here they are making a double album. They're masters of sound design. This album sounds fantastic, but it has a kind of painterly approach to it. They're kind of picking samples and from all sorts of records, combining it with electronic rhythms, ambient, sound design, synthesizers, and it becomes almost so exquisite that it can almost just be on in the background. And I think that's its downfall. It almost becomes a mush of beautifully curated samples and sound. Having said that, I love this record. I do love this record, Lifeforms by Future Sound. Let's talk about this record. Yes, talk. Now, I didn't know this record until about 2 weeks ago. You gave me it on CD, and I kind of put it on not expecting much. It's great. It's great. It's the Trevor Rabin version.
Well, I think that's why I gave it to you, because I thought it would change your mind about what they were doing during that period.
It's great. Let's have a listen. Anyone here skeptical about this record and that doesn't know it? Yeah. Okay.
Everybody.
I was too. Okay. Let's see if we can change your mind. Tim, just talk amongst yourself.
Yeah, so basically this is the 90125 Big Generator lineup of the band, and they've got together in the mid-90s at a point where no one is interested, and they released about 3 studio albums around this time. So even in Britain, from a band that were regularly #1, they were hitting number 58 in the charts. And so they were obviously creating and crafting music that meant a lot to them, but people were not listening.
I don't hear a band that have given up. Now, whether you like that, I mean, it's a very polished, very tweezed, very produced album, a lot of American influence. It's very Trevor Rabin-led. I don't hear a band that have given up. I don't hear a band that are complacent. I still think they sound enthusiastic about the music they're making. You could argue in 1994 that's the last thing anyone wanted to hear in 1994. And it wasn't successful. And it wasn't even on my radar at the time. I wasn't really listening to this kind of music at the time anyway. But hearing it now, I'm like, you know what? That's a good record. That's a band that are engaged, still passionate about what they're doing, and still on form. What happened after this is another matter, but this for me, I was very surprised, very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, that's why I gave it to you.
You gave it to me. You liked it so much.
I liked
you
it
gave
so
it
much.
away.
I gave it to you.
Yeah. Okay. Another album that's kind of out of time in a way this year is the Marillion album Brave, which is a 70-minute concept record. It's very good, isn't it? It's no, you wanted to talk about this, Tim, didn't you? The idea that. Well, you want to talk about the idea that everyone's album suddenly became 75 minutes long.
Oh yeah, that's one of the problems I think that with the era of CD. You know, for me, the album years, I think when CD becomes the format, people work to the format. And I think it led to incredibly bloated albums. So quite a lot of the ambient albums, it sort of works for. But the Soundgarden album, which I think is fantastic, I think would have even been better.
It's 80 minutes long.
40-minute albums.
Yeah, I agree.
Because I think it's really difficult to appreciate that level of complexity, that density of sound. You almost feel bombarded by it after a while. And I think with the Marillion album, again, it's too long, but it's got some amazing stuff. This is a band, again, who are on form. They're reinventing themselves. They're bringing new influences to play, you know, this fantastic Talk and Blue Nile elements on this album, as well as where they've come from conceptually, Pink Floyd. So again, it's a band who are still listening, still doing something fresh, and brilliant cover artwork by our good friend Carl Glover as well.
It's a good record. And here you have the Stephen Wilson remix edition in a 5 LP box set. There you go. So, you mentioned Pink Floyd. Sorry? Who's that? Yeah, who is that indeed? Yeah.
A chancer.
You mentioned Pink Floyd. Division Bell came out this year. I really like it. Pink Floyd, what can I say? My favourite band.
Well, I mean, it's Division Bell, I suppose, is a more natural version of what had preceded it, Momentary Lapse of Reason, where they kind of, in a sense, I remember Roger Waters calling that a brilliant Pink Floyd forgery, and I can understand why he's saying this, but I think that by Division Bell, they're sounding like a band. There's something more organic about it. It's quite heartfelt. I mean, I like A Momentary Lapse of Reason. It's one of those albums that
I love it. I love
kind of grown on me as well since it was released. But Division Bell, I think I immediately connected with more, partly because of that more organic soundscape, the sense that Richard Wright was more a part of the writing and the singing as well. So I think it's a good album myself.
Zappa's Civilization Phase 2 and King Crimson's Vrooom also came out this year in the progressive rock category.
Well, I think Crimson's Vrooom is worth talking about because it precedes Thrack, which was the studio album released afterwards, and it's Thrack in a raw form. So I really like it, and what you can hear is Fripp, again, it's interesting if we talk about that in relation to Peter Hamill's album of this year, Roaring Forties. The Roaring Forties, Peter Hamill is by this stage almost detached from the world of music. It does not sound like anything that's happening. There's no trip hop, there's no Brit hop, there's nothing in it. And there's no grunge, whereas King Crimson kind of know that the grunge bands are counting Red as an influence. You know, the producer Butch Vig was a massive fan of Red. People like Kurt Cobain would have known Crimson. Soundgarden would have known Crimson. And I think that Crimson very neatly bring back elements of their mid-70s sound into the mid-90s. And they're on fire. So Vrooom, I think, had a real urgency about it and a real sense of a band from the 70s who had reinvented themselves in the 80s. Reinventing themselves again for that 90s sound palette that was more used to the heavier sounds of grunge.
Let's talk about mainstream music. I'm just quickly, Prince, Come, Madonna, Bedtime Stories, Everything But the Girl we talked about, Seal 2 came out. My favourite album of the year that I would say comes from a more of a pop mainstream, although they're kind of outliers in a way, is the Jamiroquai album, Return of the Space Cowboy. Jamiroquai, eternally unfashionable, certainly in the UK. I think there was a section of the music press that always considered them to be slightly naff and slightly retro. I fucking love them. And this album, Return of the Space Cowboy, I'll tell you, I'm going to play you a little bit of the opening track here, Just Another Story, which is a 9-minute long jazz funk epic. They're just so brilliant at what they do. And yes, it's nostalgic. And yes, it's familiar. Stevie Wonder, Crusaders. You can hear Earth, Wind & Fire. You can hear all this stuff. This track, we were talking earlier about how nowadays we expect everything to be quantized, perfectly in tune. This is a band on fire, cutting a track live in the studio. Fucking love it. Jamiroquai. Anyway, right. We need to move on. We've got about 2 minutes left. So
2 minutes and 50 albums.
Yeah, about 50 albums, yeah. Albums we haven't had time to talk about, I'm afraid, and I don't think we are going to have time to talk about. Neil Young, Sleeps with Angels, great record.
Great album. Neil Young still being very inventive.
Joni Mitchell's Turbulent Indigo.
Good album.
Laurie Anderson's Bright Red.
Really good. Brian Eno's involved.
Tori drinking game favourite. Tori Amos, Under the Pink. Julian Cope's Altogether. Sinead O'Connor's Universal Mode. It's a great year, isn't it? Another Arthur Russell, Another Thought. David Byrne's self-titled album. Nick Cave, Let Love In. Sparks. Christian Hurst. So some other great albums going on.
And I, own quite a few of those. The Sparks, the Tori Amos, great albums.
But we haven't got time to talk about any of those things because, as usual, we've overrun on the albums we have talked about. Tim.
Yeah.
So the end of every episode.
Have we missed anything?
No, I don't think so. Well, we probably have, but those are the ones on our list. We always, at the end of every podcast where we talk about a year, each of us try to pick our favourite album from the year and the album we feel has had the most long-term influence on popular music. So, Tim, what would be your favourite album of the year?
I don't know. I suppose, Portishead was one of those albums that I absolutely loved at the time and played to death. The 9 Inch Nails I adored and still adore. There are quite a number of records that I could say that, still have some time. And as we said, the Jeff Buckley album, as soon as you heard it, as soon as I saw him live and as soon as you hear the album, you knew it was going to be something you'd be talking about 10 years, 20 years from that point.
Yeah, I mean, I would pick 9 Inch Nails' Downward Spiral as probably my favourite album of the year. And it still sounds amazing to me. It still sounds amazing. In terms of the most influential record, I mean, you have to look at Portishead, obviously, as a sound that was very much imitated.
And I think the neoclassical as well.
The neoclassical,
that's still so much a part of contemporary music that in some ways that Carl Jenkins neoclassical sound that appeals to your dad is all over television, films.
And very symptomatic of the way music has gone. Playlist culture. Music for yoga, music for coffee break, music for sleeping, music for insomniacs. All of these playlists where these kind of songs this music effortlessly fits into that.
And I would have said, if we'd have done this show maybe 3 years ago, I'd have probably said the Nas album. But I think that hip-hop's influence at the moment, it'll probably come back. But it does feel as if that's waned in the last 2-3 years.
Possibly. I think like a lot of music, it's got to a point where it's been so progressive for so long that it's now struggling to reinvent itself. Particularly in the era where people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. But yeah, the Nas album for me was the revelation from this year of albums I actually.
I thought it was Yes Talk.
Well, also, I didn't know that record. It's a really good record.
It's a very good record.
Yes, sir. Yeah. How much did we pay this bloke to come and sit there and shoot?
I got him quite cheap, €200.
Okay. We'll make the direct debit transfer to you.
Look, obviously,
thank you very much,
we did debate discussing Flowermouth and even the album I did with Richard Barbieri this year.
No, I didn't want to discuss that.
Shit. And we thought in the end that this is about other people's music. But yeah, Flowermouth was an amazing album to make. And obviously I could indeed talk about 2 hours about how it was made, the people we worked with, and the fact that it, for me, I think was a template for what we went on to do in terms of the idealism. Because a little like the Suede album, we went against everything that was particularly popular and fashionable in the British press, and we just made something that was beautiful and important to us, and worked with some musicians who we held in high esteem and we still hold in high esteem. Robert Fripp, Ian
Oh, for
Carr,
fuck's sake.
Jazz and Barbarian Khan.
I was waiting for the Robert Fripp to come in. Right.
Robert Fripp.
Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. We've managed to keep that to 2 hours. That was tough.
On a drinking game favorite, I was going to say the Peter Hamill album is interesting because he does a 20-minute
We
track.
finished him. It's finished.
He does a 20-minute track which evokes Van der Graaf Generator. And, of course, Van der Graaf are about to,
Would you like to get all the other drinking game favourites in now?
And then there's a beautiful song that ends the album. I think, is it Your Tall Ship? You'll know it.
I don't know what you're talking about now.
Peter Hamill's
I've
Roaring
never heard
40s.
that record, no.
What?
I don't know that Peter Hamill record.
There's only one response to that.
Fine!
Anyway, okay, well, whatever. All your drinking game favourites, Robert Fripp, Brian Eno, Kate Bush, David Sylvian, Mark Hollis,
Blue Nile.
Blue Nile.
Even the Blue Nile.
Yeah, David Bowie, all that.
David Bowie, of course.
All those, all your drinking game favourites. So just so you understand the context of this, the people that listen to the podcast have a drinking game where they know there's certain artists we will always we can be talking about some obscure album, a rock and roll album from 1958, and Tim will somehow get Robert Fripp into the conversation. Or Brian Eno.
Well, it's true. Listen, Elvis
yeah.
Presley, because obviously Scotty Moore was influential on Robert Fripp.
Exactly.
Django Reinhardt influential on Robert Fripp.
So they have this drinking game that every time Tim mentions Robert Fripp, they have to have a shot of vodka or something. So
it was started by a teacher in Birkenhead, I believe.
Yeah. Don't try it at home is all I'll say. Thank you very much, folks. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I'll see you later.